On. Hi, everyone. It is my privilege and honor to introduce Peter Beinart. Peter is an internationally renowned journalist, professor, and political commentator. He is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newman Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He's an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, an MSNBC political commentator, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times. Thank you so much for being with us today, Peter.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, let's get going. What do you believe is the role of diaspora Jewish communities in relation to the State of Israel? And to what extent is there a distinctive role the South African Jewish community should be playing, considering our history of systematic racism and fascist governments?
Thank you. So I think there is an important role that diaspora Jews need to play. First of all, almost half of the Jews in the world live in the State of Israel. So to the degree that we feel a sense of obligation to that very large group of our own people that live there, I think we have to care about their welfare, just like we would care about the welfare of any Jewish community, that all Jews are supposed to be sureties for one another, are supposed to look after one another. Secondly, the State of Israel speaks in the name of the Jewish people, as the state of the Jewish people. So even if we are not citizens of that state, we are implicated in it because it makes a claim on us. And finally, the State of Israel is the great experiment in Jewish power. For 2,000 years, Jews were stateless. And Jews developed an ethical tradition, but that ethical tradition was not really tested through political power. Jews did not have generally political power over other groups. So I think actually the Jewish ethical tradition itself is very much at stake in how Jews behave in a situation in which they are no longer politically powerless. And to the second half of your question, which I think is immensely important, the South African Jewish community, I think, has an extraordinarily important role to play because of its experience under apartheid and since apartheid. There are many important differences between Israel-Palestine and apartheid South Africa, but painfully, there are also important similarities. A similarity is that you have a system of legal domination by one group over another. It doesn't play itself out in exactly the same way, but the painful reality is, even though it's a painful reality for many in our community, is that everywhere between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, Jews enjoy rights that Palestinians don't enjoy. And indeed, that most of the Palestinians under Israeli control, those in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, are not even citizens of the country that dominates their lives. They can't vote for the government that makes decisions that shape their lives every single day. What justifies this system of legal domination is fear. The fear that if there were political equality, that Jews would be killed, that Jews would be destroyed, that at the very least they would be oppressed, they would be forced to flee. And any white South African, including any white Jewish South African who lived under apartheid, will remember the way in which fear was deployed to justify this racist domination under apartheid, and the way in which many white South Africans, including those in my own family, and many Jewish white South Africans, genuinely believe that a system of political equality would lead to their oppression or indeed to their death. Now, in retrospect, we can see that actually what produced that white South Africans, Jewish South Africans, were safer when apartheid ended, because what was producing that fear was the violence that was inflicted upon Black South Africans, that white South Africans feared would then be inflicted back upon them. And the only way to relieve those fears was to end that system of violent oppression, because under conditions of equality, violent resistance is no longer necessary. that once the ANC became a political party, it didn't need armed resistance anymore because Black South Africans could advocate for themselves nonviolently through the political process. I believe that core reality is also the case in Israel-Palestine, that the fear that Jews have of Palestinians is the result not of anything inherent in Palestinians, although that there is a process of racist dehumanization that makes people talk about Palestinians that way, just as so many white South Africans talk in that dehumanizing way about Black South Africans. But the threat of violence is the result of the system of violent oppression that Palestinians experience. And I'm not going to suggest that anything in an equal Israel-Palestine would be simple or easy. You know better than me that an equal post-apartheid South Africa is not simple or easy, but fundamentally, in its core, it is a more safe and peaceful place for everyone because you do not have the violence of oppression producing violence in response.
Absolutely. Thank you. So my second question, building from that. So as South Africans, we are privileged now to live under constitutional democracy. So how can and should diaspora Jewry show support and opposition for an increasingly authoritarian and ultra-nationalist Israeli government?
I think the single most important thing that diaspora Jews can do is go to see for themselves. You know, is to ensure that when we go to Israel and enjoy all the wonderful and beautiful things that Israel has to offer, that we also go and see Palestinian life under Israeli control. If you don't do that, you end up, you know, again, it's a little bit like the equivalent of going to apartheid South Africa and never going to a township. You get a fundamentally false picture of the reality. And also you end up participating in a process of dehumanization. If you only talked about Black South Africans, but didn't listen to Black South Africans and didn't see the way they lived, you end up becoming complicit in a process of racist dehumanization. And if you only talk about Palestinians, but you don't listen to Palestinians and you don't see Palestinian life under Israeli control, whether you want to or not, you end up becoming complicit in a process of dehumanization. And so I think the most important thing is to go see for yourself. When, in my experience, no matter what one's prior political preconceptions are, right, left, or center, people are shocked when they actually go and see the realities of Palestinian life without any basic rights in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. And then the question is what one does with that knowledge. And I think I would hope one does with that knowledge. And if one can't go, by the way, one can invite Palestinians to speak in our shuls, in our Jewish day schools, in our Jewish institutions, something that in the United States rarely happens. You know, it says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. We can learn from Palestinians, and then we can take that knowledge and we can say to the state of Israel, that we will act in a kind of loving resistance to the oppression that you are inflicting on Palestinians. Not because we hate the Jews of Israel, God forbid, we feel a deep connection to them, but we also feel a profound moral obligation to the cause of justice, which we believe in our bones is best not just for Palestinians, but also for Israeli Jews, because as you South Africans know better than anybody else, ending oppression liberates the oppressor, not only the oppressed. And then we can look at the complicity that we may bear, whether it's in the United States with our military aid, with our diplomatic efforts to ensure Israeli complicity, and we can act to end our complicity with acts of oppression that violate our highest Jewish ideals.
Absolutely. I really love that concept, loving resistance. I think that's brilliant. My next question is, when confronted with a critique of Israeli actions or policies, most South African Jews, and specifically our formal community organizations, don't necessarily confront the content of the critique, but rather deflect and often claim anti-Semitism. So how do you suggest we engage with and bring awareness to the situation in Israel-Palestine in a way that acknowledges the dangers of anti-Semitism, but doesn't use anti-Semitism as a shield against any and all criticism of Israel?
I think it starts with having an honest conversation about how we define anti-Semitism. It seems to me that if you believe that Israeli Jews do not have the right to live safely and equally in the land, in Israel-Palestine, then that is an anti-Semitic view. But if you believe that Israeli Jews should live equally alongside their Palestinian neighbors in a state that does not privilege them over Palestinians, how can we call that anti-Semitism? How can the call for legal equality, equality under the law, the very thing that brave South Africans, including South African Jews, fought for, how can we call that anti-Semitism? Why would a Palestinian not want to be treated legally equally with Jews? We may have our anxieties about what legal equality would mean, but surely there's something morally perverse about telling a Palestinian who simply wants to be treated equally alongside a Jew that makes them a bigot. It seems to me it makes them the opposite of a bigot, and that our conversation about anti-Semitism as it relates to Palestine has become tragically not a defense of Jewish equality, which is what the struggle against anti-Semitism should be, since Jews have equal rights to all other human beings. It has become a defense of Jewish supremacy, that we have developed a discourse in which, unless you accept that Jews should have more rights than Palestinians, then you are an anti-Semite. That morally, to me, just doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. And my final question to you is, what is your message to and for the South African Jewish community, and specifically for JDI, the Jewish Democratic Initiative, as we move forward into 2023?
Well, first, I would just say it's deeply moving to me to be able to speak with you. You know, although my parents immigrated from Cape Town just before I was born, we spent a lot of my childhood in Cape Town. It was the place that I grew to love Yiddishkeit, since that's where all of my extended family were. There were no family that we had in Boston where my parents moved. It was where and it was also where I began to wrestle as a young person with this tension between a deep commitment to one's own family and one's own community, and the recognition that a community and family that one loves passionately can also be complicit in terrible oppression against other people. And my heroes growing up became particularly those South African Jews, from Joe Slovo to Albie Sachs to the defendants at the Rivonia trial, who struggled in the best traditions of our people for equality, even though in some ways it might have seemed historically anomalous that they had ended up on this other part of the world. When Joe Slovo, as a Yiddish-speaking kid, came to South Africa, just like when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, as a Yiddish speaker, came from Poland to the United States and saw a black man shining a white man's shoes and knew in his gut that something in his Jewishness told him that this was wrong. It was that spark that seems to me is what led South African Jews to be so overrepresented in the struggle for justice in South Africa. And so as I said earlier, I think you have an immensely important role to play. Most diaspora Jewish communities have not had that experience. They have a story of Jewish victimhood, of course, as we all do, but they don't generally have that experience of also having been on the side of the oppressors, of having been essentially given by virtue of their skin color the right to be on the other side of this. And therefore, South African Jews know, I think, in a way that many other Jews don't know, that we as Jews have the capacity to choose. We must choose. We can be victims. We can also be victimizers. We are not insulated from that by our own history of oppression. It's a choice we have to make. And I think South African Jews have shown that choosing and struggling for political equality can produce incredible ties and links to other communities, links that can overcome that fear, that dominant fear, and actually create the possibility of a Jewish community that lives in equality and is enriched by the equality that it has with other communities, even though freedom can be difficult and messy, as you all know. And so I think that the work you're doing is enormously important to build a global network of Jews and Palestinians and others around the world who are struggling for equality, so that Jews and Palestinians can both live in the land that they love, enrich one another, nourish one another, keep each other safe, and be a model for the world, a light onto the nations, Jews and Palestinians together.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been an absolute honor talking to you. You've given us a lot to think about and take away into our community discussion happening later. So thank you very, very much for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.